Welcome to the lecture for Bio Unit 3, Lecture 1. We're going to kick off this unit starting off with a little bit of chemistry review. Some of this stuff might be brand new to a lot of you, but some of it might be actually just review from stuff that you've learned in middle school. Either way, we're going to cover a good portion of chemistry today, so we're going to jump right into it. The points that we're going to talk about today is talking about the chemistry of life, right? So we want to cover basically only the chemical components that are encompassed in biology. So what are the chemicals that are necessary for biology? We're also going to talk about some properties of water that are really important for all living things. Like when scientists in NASA are looking for signs of life on other planets, what we look for is water, right? Because water is essential to life. It's really important. So we're going to make sure that we understand the properties of water in order to relate those properties to different living things. Then we're going to look at the four major macromolecules that all living things have. All living things have protein, carbohydrates, fats, and nucleic acids. Those four things are really important for every single organism, every single type of cell. And we're going to talk about the properties of each one of those and see how they contribute to the life of the organism. Finally, we're going to jump right into enzymes. That's going to be towards the end of class. And don't forget, for homework, you'll have this chemistry review practice, and that's actually going to be due by the beginning of next class period. So you'll have a couple of, you'll have a little bit of time today at the end of class to work on that. And then whatever you don't finish will be for homework, and that will be due by the beginning of next class. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. These are the essential questions we're going to be able to ask today. How does life result from chemical structure and function? And how do matter and energy move through an ecosystem? So these are both things that we're going to be able to discuss and learn about today. And so if you want, you can spend a minute or so talking about this with your neighbor or just pondering this in your head. But right now, what we're going to do is just jump right into the next slide. And once we cover all this material, this is what I would like for you to be able to do. I want you to be able to distinguish between atoms and molecules, like what's the difference between an atom and a molecule. Distinguish between different types of bonds. There's two different types of bonds that we're going to look at today. One is called a covalent bond, and another one is called an ionic bond. We're going to be looking at what organic molecules are. You might have heard of a specific subject that a lot of people complain about when they go to college, and that is organic chemistry. And so we're going to look at that word organic and how that refers to chemistry and also to biology. We're definitely going to list the four most common elements in living matter, like what are the most common elements that we see, and explain what makes a molecule polar. So there's something called polarity with molecules. Something could be polar or non-polar. So we're going to talk about what makes molecules polar. All right, so with point number one, we want to address that molecules are made of atoms. Okay, atoms are going to be the smallest subunit of things that cannot be divided without losing their properties. So in this diagram in the red box here, we have one atom of oxygen. And one atom of oxygen cannot be cut up into pieces without destroying the oxygen itself. So this one atom of oxygen is the smallest thing that has the properties of oxygen. And in this example, we see that oxygen has it's got some green things in the middle and some yellow things and then some like minus signs around. They're not actually those colors, but they're here for a representation. Those green things, those are going to be representing the protons. Those yellow things are going to be representing something called neutrons. And those negative signs are going to be things called electrons. So in this one atom, we have, let's say 8 of each. We have 8 protons, 8 neutrons, and 8 electrons. Now, most of the time for smaller atoms, you will have the same number of protons as you would neutrons. So that number is going to be the same. Sometimes it's a little bit different when you get to like bigger atoms or bigger elements, but the protons and the neutrons usually for smaller ones are going to be the same. What is usually almost always the same is the number of protons and the number of electrons. So in this case, we have 8 of each. 8 protons. Each proton has a positive charge of +1. So if each one is +1 and we have 8 of them, that means in the middle here we got +8. And each electron is -1. And so we have +1 for each proton, -1 for each electron. That means +8, -8. So the total charge of this thing would be 0. All right, we're kind of jumping all over what these things are called. These things are called the subatomic particles, these protons, neutrons, and electrons. But that's basically all you really need to understand from those things. Like if we have the same number of protons and electrons, that will determine what the charge is of the atom, and it's usually going to be 0. All right, the difference between an atom and a molecule, though, is that a molecule is made up of multiple atoms. Okay, so over here in a water molecule, we know the formula for water is H2O. That means we have 2 of the hydrogens and then 1 of the oxygen. So those 2 hydrogens are represented here in blue, and the oxygen is represented by this gray molecule here, or this gray atom here. So that's the main difference between molecules and atoms, is that molecules are made up of atoms. This, of course, is the periodic table. It should look familiar if you've never studied the periodic table. It should still look kind of familiar, like you've probably seen this before in the science textbook or maybe on the internet somewhere. If you have studied the periodic table, then you're probably recognizing it even more. This is a table of all of the elements that exist as far as we know. So on our planet, we have all of these different elements, and everything that exists is made up of a combination of some of these elements. All right. In nature, only 92 of them exist like just naturally. So the other ones from 93 all the way to 118, those are all man-made. So we're not really going to consider those in biology. We're only going to be looking at some of these. We're not even going to look at all of them, but we should understand that up to 92, element 92, which is uranium, all of those do occur in nature. And they're all listed in order of how many protons they have. So you can see here that number up the top, that's the atomic number. That's going to be the number of protons they have. So hydrogen has 1 proton. Helium over here in the top right corner has 2. And then we go to the next row. Lithium has 3 protons. Beryllium has 4. So on and so forth. And that's really going to be a characteristic of what kind of element you're going to have, the properties it's going to have, things like that. And so we also group this periodic table. It kind of looks funny. It's got like this weird outline, like there's a big gap here in the middle. There's a gap up here, and up here where it says PubChem, that's like there's a gap over there. So like, why do we have all of these gaps? Well, what we do is we organize all of these elements by their families. So you can see they're color coded, like this whole column on the left, far left, this red column, all of these atoms like lithium, potassium, sodium, rubidium, cesium, francium, all of those are going to have the same type of properties, where they're going to react very similarly. Likewise, if we go on the far right, all of these here, helium, neon, argon, krypton, so on and so forth, they're going to have the same type of properties as well. So that's how we kind of categorize these things. We put them in different families, if you will, and that's basically the structure of the periodic table. Now, how do we read one of those squares on the periodic table? Again, the top number, that's going to be the atomic number. That's the number of protons that we have. The number of protons is usually, like I mentioned before, the number of electrons. I want to say like 99% of the time, if an element is existing naturally, it's going to have the same number of protons as electrons. The symbol for the abbreviation is always going to start with a capital letter. Sometimes it's 1 letter and sometimes it's 2, and the second letter is always going to be a lowercase letter. I don't think there's ever a case where you have 3 letters as the abbreviation. And also, there's no 2 elements that have the same abbreviation, so you'll never see it twice. Usually underneath the abbreviation, you'll see the name of the element. So we're looking at element number 5, which is boron, and that's how you can see the name. And then finally, we have something called the atomic mass. All right, and the atomic mass is basically how much does this thing weigh? And the atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Now, this number right here is a decimal usually, and that's because it's taking an average of them. And so what we can do is just round to the nearest whole number if it's not a whole number already. So if we're looking at 10.811, we're going to round that to 11. And so if the atomic mass is 11 and 11 is protons plus neutrons, we can kind of figure out how many neutrons there are by doing just some simple math, right? So we have 11 as the mass. 5 of that mass is going to be the protons, because we know it's element number 5. And so what's left is 6, and 6 is going to be the number of neutrons. So in this sentence here, practice, boron has blank protons, blank neutrons, and blank electrons. It has 5 protons, 6 neutrons, and 5 electrons. So that's how you would read a square on the periodic table. The next part we're going to talk about is the difference between molecules and compounds. And depending on their properties, atoms may bond together to form compounds or molecules. A molecule is any combination of bonded atoms, where a compound is a molecule that contains at least 2 different types of atoms. So again, molecules contain more than one atom, which we've learned about a couple slides ago over here. Molecules have more than one atom, but they don't necessarily have to have different types of atoms. So over here we have 2 oxygen atoms, and they're bonded together. So that's still an oxygen molecule. So we have oxygen here and oxygen here, and 2 atoms would make a molecule. But if those elements are different, so like in water, we have technically this is a molecule still, but it's also a compound, because a compound is a molecule, a type of molecule that has multiple different types of atoms or elements. So you have oxygen and hydrogen, 2 different elements. So that would form a compound. The types of bonds that you see here, there's these lines in between the elements. There's different types of bonds here. The first one is going to be a covalent bond. A covalent bond only happens between 2 nonmetals, and it's usually one of the stronger types of bonds. It's also where those electrons are kind of being shared between these atoms, but we're not going to get too far into that, into the chemistry of it. But it's a pretty strong bond. The next type of bond is something called an ionic bond. That's going to be between a metal and a non-metal. It's also pretty strong, but it's not as strong as a covalent bond. The atoms here, they're not sharing electrons anymore. They're just like one is donating an electron to another. And then finally, we're not going to worry about metallic bonds, but metallic bonds only occur between metals. Like if you're making a metallic bond between copper and gold, for instance, or zinc and tin or something like that. Different types of metals will form different types of bonds. So, but we're not going to worry about that in biology, of course. So, like I mentioned before, covalent bonds, they share electrons, and if they are shared equally, the molecule is considered to be non-polar. Okay, so it's like the analogy I like to make is like, suppose you have 2 siblings here, and you have a sibling in a red shirt and a sibling in a blue shirt, right? And they're sharing a meal. If the siblings are twins and they're the same size, they'll probably, most likely, eat the same amount of food, right? So they're sharing an equal amount of food. And so that relationship would be considered what's called non-polar, right? But let's say you have a sibling in a blue shirt who is, 5 years older than the sibling in the red shirt. He's definitely going to be eating more of the food that they're sharing. Let's say they're splitting a pizza and he eats, 3/4 of the pizza, and this one eats 1/4 of the pizza. So that's unequal sharing of the electrons that they're putting into the relationship here. And so you end up with different sharing amount of those electrons, and that relationship is now called polar. So that's a polar molecule. Now there's a reason why we kind of differentiate between these two. Like, why do we have non-polar versus polar? It's because non-polar substances don't like to mix with polar substances. So if you have a non-polar chemical, and it won't mix with a polar chemical. An example that I can give you is, let's say a non-polar chemical is like, let's say olive oil. Olive oil is a type of lipid. It's a type of fat. It is non-polar. It will not mix with water, which happens to be polar. Water is polar. Olive oil is non-polar. If you try to put those two together in let's say you're cooking and you put it in a pot, those two are not going to mix together at all. Finally, the last thing I want to mention in this diagram here is something you have an ionic bond, which is a donation of electrons. So that's different from a covalent bond. Covalent bonds both are sharing, but an ionic bond is like one is sharing. And so then you end up with a positive and a negative charge. A great example of this would be like salt, which is sodium chloride, NaCl. Salt is an example of an ionic bond. All right, so like I mentioned before, water is a polar molecule with covalent bonds. And the reason why water is polar is because we know the formula for water is H2O. It would be nonpolar if all of those elements were the same size. But the only thing that's the same size are these two hydrogens right here. The oxygen is much bigger than the two hydrogens. And so it's actually going to be pulling on those electrons a little bit more. It's going to be a little bit more hungry for those electrons that are being shared in the bonds here. So because oxygen has a partial negative charge, because it's grabbing onto those electrons more, it's going to be pulling on the electrons, which gives it a little bit of a negative charge. It's going to leave these two hydrogens with a positive charge. And so you have what this ends up being is you have a positive region here on the bottom where you have the hydrogens, and you have a negative region up top where the oxygens are. So that's kind of forms like, if you can imagine, like this would be a globe and you have a north pole and a south pole. You have a positive pole and you have a negative pole. So that's what makes this whole thing polar. All right, salt is, like I mentioned before, an ionic bond, sodium chloride. It's because basically the chloride has all these electrons kind of floating around it, but it's kind of missing one in that spot right there. And sodium has an extra one that's just kind of hanging around. So sodium's like, hey, I'm willing to donate this extra one because I really don't need it, and it's just kind of hanging around. And chlorine's like, oh, perfect, I'll take it. So it'll take that electron, and now these two kind of have formed a bond between each other because there was a donation of an electron. So that's an example of an ionic bond. All right, now we're going to talk about organic molecules. And organic molecules have to contain two elements, and these elements are absolutely essential to all organic chemistry and basically all of life. And those two elements are going to be carbon and hydrogen. Okay, those are going to be the most common elements that we see in organic molecules. Here are some examples of organic molecules. C6H12O6. This is something that we're going to be talking about a lot throughout this year. We'll mention it several times. That is glucose, and glucose is basically just pure sugar, like cane sugar that we get from the store. That's going to be glucose. We also have something called amino acids, which can be found in proteins, lipids, or also known as fats, and then also DNA. All of these things are organic molecules that will have both carbon and hydrogen in their chemical structure. Some inorganic stuff that's also important to consider when we talk about biology. Carbon dioxide is an example of something that's inorganic. Even though it does contain carbon, it does not contain hydrogen. There's no H's here. So that's an inorganic molecule because there's no hydrogens. And then water is inorganic as well. Even though it contains hydrogen here, the H's, there's no carbon. So it can't be considered organic if there's no carbon and hydrogen. Okay. Next slide says that carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen and nitrogen are the most common elements in living things. These four elements right here make up over 98% of all biological matter. If you were to take a human, for instance, just an average person, or any organism for that matter, and you were able to take the elements in that organism and split up the organism into different chemicals, like organize all the chemicals or the elements, you would see these percentages, that 18% of it is carbon, oxygen is 65%, hydrogen is 10%, and nitrogen is 3%. So you can see the abundances of all these different elements, and all four of these make up over 98%. So it's really important to understand that this organic matter that we just started talking about, it's a lot of it's because of carbon and hydrogen, but also oxygen and nitrogen are very prevalent as well. All right, so you can go ahead, and we're going to skip the frame break in this video right now, but what we're going to do now is just go ahead and work on your chemistry review. You can open up the PDF in Canvas. Definitely use your notes that we just talked about and the periodic table to help you answer each question. And then you want to be able to turn it on Canvas. What I'm expecting is for people just to be at their tables. You can discuss answers with the person next to you, but try to keep conversations relevant. Don't try to talk about anything else. And if you have any questions, you can always email me, or you can refer to each other in the notes. And that concludes lecture 3.1 on chemistry review.